Night in the region feels like a held breath, a horizon split between a city's glow and the cold flare of an air intercept. In Baghdad and Erbil, in the hills of southern Lebanon and on rusting decks in the Red Sea, commanders map trajectories, civilians check phone alerts, and pilots watch radar traces that could mean another strike. This is not a single battle. It's a braided crisis. Israel and Iran spar through proxies, Hezbollah firing from Lebanon, militias striking U.S. positions across Iraq and Syria, the Houthis menacing commercial shipping, while Tehran calibrates deniability and deterrence. Every launch is a message. Every intercepted missile is a question about what comes next. On the other side of the ocean, Washington listens. Carrier strike groups glide into corridors of influence. Patriot batteries and theater missiles crop up in allied states. And inside the White House, advisors trade short, brittle sentences. "We can't let this spiral," a voice says in the Situation Room. The kind of line that carries the weight of soldiers on the ground and allies watching for American resolve. The dilemma is almost cinematic. Back an Israeli ally that believes its survival is at stake, while trying not to become the lightning rod for a regional war that would drag in Syria, Iraq, the Gulf, and beyond. Markets twitch with every headline. Tankers alter course. Insurance rates jump. Stock traders watch the oil ticker like a pulse monitor. For ordinary people, shopkeepers in Haifa, fishermen in Aden, parents near U.S. bases in Iraq, geopolitics is not an abstract. It's the siren that pushes families into basements and sends children to sleep with the radio on. We open here because this is where the pressure concentrates. Calibrated threats, rapid retaliation, and the ever-present risk of miscalculation. Over the next segments we'll follow the rocket trails, the diplomatic phone calls at dawn, and the calculations that could contain or explode this crisis. What worries you most about the U.S. role, avoiding war, fueling escalation, losing influence, or being pulled along? If you want to stay with this story as it unfolds, subscribe. Next, we trace the first strikes that pushed everyone to the edge. Night fell like a low drumbeat across the desert, and the map rooms lit up in Washington and Tel Aviv like operating theaters. In Baghdad, young Marines jolted awake to jarring alarms. Rockets had slammed into a logistics hub, sending concrete dust into the early sky and flattening a row of Humvees. In Syria, a remote base took shrapnel from a barrage that left a crater and a rigid, practiced silence among the remaining troops. Satellite feeds showed streaks of light crossing the Gulf, ballistic shadows traced against the moon. On a carrier in the eastern Mediterranean, sailors moved with the focus of people who have rehearsed chaos until routine. Jets burned fuel, radars chirped warnings, and the captain's face was a map of concentration. Across dozens of secure lines, policy aides passed summaries to the president. Groupings of proxy strikes linked by tactics and timing, Houthi swarms pushing shipping lanes, Hezbollah testing Israel's batteries along the northern border. The patterns were unmistakable to any strategist worth their salt. Calibrated pressure, plausible deniability, an attempt to force reactions without opening a full front. But calibration is a dangerous word when lives, cred, and markets hang in the balance. A hurried call between the White House and Jerusalem crackled with tension. Netanyahu's voice was sharp, insisting on decisive responses. Biden's voice, measured, asked the harder questions. How to protect American forces, how to keep Israel free to defend itself, and how to avoid illuminating the path to an uncontrollable regional war. Military options stacked in classified briefs like choices on a scale. Limited strikes intended to degrade capabilities, robust air defenses bolstered around bases, a show of carriers and Aegis cruisers to deter further escalation, and the shadow option, direct retaliation against Iranian assets. Each had ripple effects. A limited strike might placate an ally and still provoke a sharper counterattack. Reinforcing defenses would save lives but risk looking passive. And the economic fallout, oil spikes, disrupted trade through the Red Sea and Strait of Hormuz, would be immediate and global. Back in Tehran, commanders watched the same feeds and interpreted U.S. movements through a different lens. Signals versus threats. On both sides, a misread posture, a too-quick strike, a misplaced message could become the fuse. As decision time tightened, the White House prepared the next public line. firm, calibrated, but vague enough to leave options open. It was a brinkmanship unlike any ordinary crisis. A test of restraint that felt like preparation for escalation. What worries you most about America's role here? Avoiding war, fueling escalation, losing influence, or being pulled in? If this thread matters, give it a like and stick around. Next, we follow the president's choice as the region holds its breath. The nights in Baghdad and northeastern Syria have a new soundtrack. Distant booms, chatter on tactical radios, and the low, constant hum of generators powering hardened bunkers. On a dusty airfield, an exhausted lieutenant wipes dust from a night vision scope and says, half to himself, half to whoever will listen. Every flight feels like a bet. Across the region, Houthi skiffs slip through the Red Sea's shadows, fishermen-turned militants launch drones at convoys, and Hezbollah fires volleys that make small towns into fields of glass. Each strike carries a signature. Crude, precise, deniable. And each signature pushes Washington and Tel Aviv into tighter, angrier rhythms. Inside the Situation Room, the maps are alive. Red arcs showing missile paths, blue icons for carrier strike groups now steaming toward the Gulf, and a cluster of trembling numbers, oil futures, insurance rates, merchant traffic reroutes. Advisors trade sharp, short lines. We need to protect the force. Deterrence requires visibility. But visible equals escalatory. You hear the human side beneath the doctrine. Spouses waiting at home, commanders calculating civilian risk, diplomats composing messages meant to calm allies while signaling resolve. On the streets of Tel Aviv and Haifa, people run to shelters when air defenses bloom in the sky. Ironies of modern war where missiles create pyrotechnics that double as a nation's last comfort. Iranian proxies test limits, probing supply lines in Syria and Iraq, the maritime convoy routes near Bab el-Mandeb, and Israel's northern border. Each probe is both tactic and message, flexibility to strike, plausible deniability to dissuade full-scale retaliation. Markets twitch. Tanker routes shift south. Insurers add surcharges. A grocery aisle somewhere in Europe holds a spot of sudden scarcity. In Moscow and Beijing, analysts lean in, noting how a distracted America could be tempted or trapped. Opportunity and risk folded together. And above it all, a president weighs words and weapons. A single public statement could steady allies or ignite fury. A single strike could be measured retaliation, or a breadcrumb on a path nobody wants to walk. What worries you most about Washington's role now? Containing the flames or fueling them? If you're following this closely, like what you hear and subscribe to keep watching. Next, we move to the moment that will define whether restraint holds or the region careens into wider war. Night falls over a desert outpost and the glare of flares turns the sand into a bruised orange. Inside a concrete bunker, a tired captain rubs his eyes and watches graphs. Incoming rocket arcs, cords pinging from a drone overhead, a steady trickle of messages from Baghdad and from the carrier strike group now steaming through the Gulf. How long do we keep taking this? He asks his XO, voice low. Until someone gives the order to stop, she replies. The answer is practically a dare. Back in Washington, the Situation Room hums like a machine. Advisors pace, generals point at layers of maps stacked in augmented reality, front lines, missile ranges, shipping lanes. One national security aide says bluntly, if we don't respond, we invite more. A diplomat counters, if we respond badly, we invite war. The president listens, face carved from fatigue and calculation. Every option feels like a cliff edge. Defend bases and risk wider retaliation, or restrain and risk being accused of abandoning allies. At sea, sailors on a destroyer watch the horizon where merchant ships, now rerouted, cut through waters thick with threat. The Houthi attacks in the Red Sea have made the shipping lanes into a choreography of caution. Convoys hugging coastlines, drones shadowing hulls, and anti-air batteries in the region alert as night watch. In Beirut and southern Lebanon, Hezbollah movement stirs like a living map, ready to exploit any fissure. Iran's fingerprints are whispered, never shouted, deniable support, clandestine shipments, a web of proxies that can be switched on. On the phone lines, Israeli officials press for decisive strikes. European capitals urge de-escalation. Regional monarchs offer behind-the-scenes shuttle diplomacy. The mood is anxious, almost cinematic. A world stage where every sound, a radar ping, a muffled explosion, a diplomatic tone, could tilt the plot. Soldiers joke dryly to keep fear at bay. A Marine brazenly says, "We didn't sign up to be chess pieces," and then checks his kit. This is the moment the narrative tightens. Deterrence hardens into posture, messaging into brinkmanship. The next call, the next launch authorization, may define whether Biden contains the crisis or watches it slip. What do you think? Will restraint hold, or is the region already past the point of return? If you want to follow what comes next, subscribe for the next episode. The smoke of the immediate crisis begins to thin, but the air is electric with new dangers. In Washington, a small group gathers behind closed doors. Generals pacing, diplomats on phones, a few aides blinking at slides that show shipping lanes rerouting around the Red Sea, insurance premiums spiking, and crude ticked up on every terminal. "We can deter without provoking," one advisor says quietly. Across the table, another counters, "Deterrence now looks a lot like preparation." No one sounds certain. That uncertainty is the story now. Out in the Gulf and the Levant, proxies recalibrate. Hezbollah tests Israeli defenses with more probing strikes. Houthi boats shadow convoys, launching another salvo that sends mariners scrambling. Iran watches from multiple vantage points, its commanders in bunkers, its diplomats in Tehran whispering with emissaries, calculating how far to push without triggering a direct U.S.-Israeli confrontation. Moscow and Beijing, patient and opportunistic, lean in. A Russian admiral's briefing references new Mediterranean patrols. Chinese commercial state vessels file for insurance exemptions and suggest alternative routes. Each move is a signal. We're watching, we can profit, and we can complicate any American response. On markets, traders trade in fear. Oil spikes a few points, then settles. Shipping companies reroute around Africa, adding days and costs that ripple into inflation talk in grocery aisles and manufacturing lines. NATO capitals exchange terse calls. Some European leaders favor de-escalation. Others urge decisive backing for Israel. Meanwhile, in U.S. TV studios, pundits parse every presidential word, domestic pressure mixing with strategic caution. If we pull too hard, a former general warns on air, we risk pulling the whole region in. If we do nothing, our credibility frays. Scenes of human consequence thread through the strategy. A family in Basra counting the cost of delayed wages because a supply ship idled in the Suez. A small Israeli town shuffling into shelters one more night. U.S. service members on base in Syria watching the night sky for incoming. This is not abstract chess, it's lives and livelihoods. As the administration balances backchannels, strikes, sanctions, and signaling, the question becomes less about immediate victory and more about longer-term position. Can Washington hold the lid on a region that wants to boil over without losing leverage elsewhere? What scares you most about America's role here? Escalation, paralysis, erosion of influence, or being dragged into another protracted conflict? If you want this conversation to keep going, tell us below, and subscribe for the final reckoning in the next chapter. The dust settles on a map that still trembles. We leave behind the missiles, the carrier decks, the late-night Situation Room images, and return to capitals where decisions are folded into a few terse lines of briefing. In Washington, a weary president weighs ally commitments against the danger of widening a war he cannot afford. Not with Ukraine in Europe's cold. Not with the Pacific heating up. In Tel Aviv, a prime minister measures retaliation against a future that could close the skies. In Tehran, commanders smile for the cameras while quietly calculating how far proxies can push without drawing a direct American hand. You can feel how small the theater is and how vast the stakes become. A drone in the Gulf interrupts a tanker convoy. A volley of rockets in Iraq wakes a base full of young soldiers. A Houthi missile forces a shipping lane to reroute, and suddenly markets wobble, insurance rates spike, and an ordinary morning in a distant supermarket costs more. Russia and China watch with careful faces, some hedging, some sharpening opportunities, and every diplomatic cable carries the weight of potential misreading. There are no grand victories here, only hard choices and damaged options. One evening, in a dimly lit command room, an aide leans in and asks, almost softly, "Sir, Do we break the cycle or just slow it? The answer is never tidy. Containment requires clarity of purpose, channels of communication open even to rivals, and a willingness to absorb political risk at home. Escalation happens in the cracks. Misfired assumptions, overconfident allies, misinterpreted intelligence. The real question for America isn't just whether it can stop the next round of strikes. It's whether it can sustain strategic steadiness across too many fronts. The Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Gulf. Can Washington restrain an ally, deter an adversary, and keep a world order from tilting? Or are we, as much as we try, just managing chaos until the next crisis? What worries you most about the U.S. role here? Avoiding war, fueling escalation, losing influence, or being pulled along? If you want to follow this closely, stay with us. We'll keep unpacking what happens next.